Well, I'm proud to be able to introduce Rowan Williams to our symposium this afternoon. As a former Archbishop of Canterbury and Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, he hardly needs an introduction from me. But he is, of course, as well, a distinguished writer and poet. And by the way, I would encourage you to buy some of the books of his which are for sale in the stall on the lower level. His links with CUSP and to William Morris may not, though, be so obvious to all of you. I first met Rowan about a year ago at an event at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where he was talking about Morris's utopian epic News from Nowhere, which he had written an introduction to the recently published edition. This is it. Other editions are available. In that talk, he made several references to CUSP as doing important work in the spirit of News from Nowhere, and referred to News from Nowhere as a deeply ethical book. So perhaps it's no surprise that when I followed those ideas up with him, his reaction was very positive. And this event is one of the fruits of that engagement. I know that in his introduction to News from Nowhere, and in other reflections on Morris's writing, Rowan foregrounds the importance of stories of resistance, something we've been debating this afternoon, stories of alternatives, and the importance of the active use of the imagination. News from Nowhere, in that sense, is a thought experiment, not a future blueprint. And I think this is an important discussion of which we are here today. So I'm delighted to introduce Rowan this afternoon.
Thank you. It's a real delight to be able to speak about this particular topic in this company, and to some extent also at the end of a very fruitful afternoon, to have a chance of reflecting on some of what's been said during the discussion. And the first thought that occurs to me, reflecting on what we've heard this afternoon, is that part of our problem culturally is that we want to avoid facing the sense of loss. We devise any number of ways of not recognizing the depth of the loss we experience, and yet, as soon as conversation arises about possible futures, we come to that recognition that we have lost something, that things have been closed down. Take one example from the last discussion. Language is one of the victims of our current social and global situation. A narrowing down of language, which translates significant concepts into the categories of ownership and exchangeability. That's not simply a matter of our language becoming more and more boring, though that's a problem in itself. It's a question about what we allow ourselves to think and the terms in which we allow ourselves to think. So, simply to take an example from my own current professional situation, once you've habituated yourself to thinking of students as clients, there are things about education you stop being able to think of. So that's the kind of loss, that's the kind of closing down that appears in language. But there's also loss, as we've heard, in terms of the sheer natural diversity and uncontrollability of our environment. We would quite like so to package our engagement with the environment that once again there were no real losses. We can compensate, we can offset. And all of that, once again, amounts to loss and closing down. that prompts me, as one way into this discussion, to think about the question we're looking at as, in some degree, a question about what is not lost or what cannot be lost. How we connect afresh with what cannot be lost and bring it to the foreground of our minds and our imaginations. Otherwise, it seems we're condemned to a constant downward spiral of loss and denial and further loss and further denial. Not simply, as I say, a question about the language we use, but a question about the actual environment we inhabit, social and, more generally, ecological. A few days ago, I was giving a talk somewhere else about two great intellectuals of the mid-20th century, George Orwell and C.S. Lewis. An unlikely couple, you might very well think, politically, religiously, imaginatively, in all kinds of other ways. And at first sight, the only thing they seem to have had in common was a devotion to the traditional English pub. But in fact, Lewis's essay on Orwell, published in the early 50s, is a remarkably sympathetic analysis of Orwell's 1984. But the point Lewis reaches in his discussion is this. The problem, he says, with 1984 is that it is not simply a harrowing, apocalyptically warning book, but that its characters have already lost. The characters of 1984 have already been the victims of a system that they can do nothing about. And Orwell, in his desperate last years, when his political and social vision became bleaker and bleaker, famously summed up the future as a boot stamping on a human face forever. Lewis, both as a religious believer and as a humanist, in the fullest possible sense of that word, argued that that could not be where the imagination rested eventually. And sympathetically, compassionately, he argues that Orwell has in some sense let down his own imaginative genius by coming to rest with that picture. And oddly enough, Lewis says Animal Farm is much better from that point of view, because that's about the process of loss. And as soon as you tell a story about how loss happens, you begin to understand it better and to face it more honestly. But lest we get too bogged down in the analysis of texts from the last century, let me just come back to that question of what's not lost. And perhaps move forward a little in arguing about what work the imagination has to do. It's been interesting and instructive to hear how regularly imagination has come back this afternoon as a category in discussion. But part of what the imagination does, of course, is to attend to and represent the actual bodily circumstances of human life. You might say that one thing that's not lost is our embodiedness. We are where we are in a world of matter and material interaction. We are irreducibly part of, literally, an ecology. That is, an oikos, a home, a territory, a space that's ours, which is logikos, which is reasonable, which is interactive and consistent. That remains true of us as human beings. That's what we think about, both in the sciences and in the humanities. It's what we represent in art, it's what we examine in our sciences. We are here embodied beings, plugged into a system of exchange, not in the sense of financial or monetary exchange, but the exchange of life and its possibilities. And that continues to be true of us. And when other things seem lost, one of the keys to a renewal of our thinking and our imagining is to remember once again that we are intelligent and intelligible bodies in an intelligent and intelligible world. We are always embedded speakers and agents. Whether we like it or not, whether we believe it or not, we don't come from nowhere or speak from nowhere. One of the ironies of the title of William Morris's News from Nowhere is that it's actually news from somewhere. News from a world where locality and the particularities of locality matter far more than they do in the society we're familiar with. News from nowhere, you might say, is a spectacularly successful retrieval of the experience of being somewhere. It's physically vivid, geographically fully imagined. For those of you who haven't read it, one of the surprises awaiting you is Morris reimagining a de-urbanized London a century or more in the future. Imagining groves of trees along the embankment of the Thames through which you can glimpse what's left of Westminster Abbey, and through which you can also glimpse the Houses of Parliament now turned into a storage for manure. Morris's wit is sometimes fairly blunt. But that sense of embodied at-homeness is one of the most striking, one of the most memorable features of Morris's own imagination. A reminder too, though this is to take us off in yet another direction, a reminder of the way in which our bodies themselves are agents of knowing. We don't just know with something inside here. We know with our nerves and our fingertips. And the very experience of seeing, hearing, tasting, knowing in the way that comes from all those things is a function of our embodied nature. We have for far too long assumed that knowing things is primarily acquiring ideas. And yet, the variegated forms of knowledge which we're all familiar with depend on our being intelligent bodies. Some of you may know the extraordinary philosophical work of Philip Shepherd on the knowing body. If you haven't come across that, I recommend it very strongly. So that, borrowing a phrase from the late, great Mary Midgley, the challenge is to change the myths we live by. And one of those myths is the myth that detaches us from our physicality and our participation in an ecology in which life is exchanged. And once you work with that kind of imaginary, an ecology in which life is exchanged, you begin to see how very eccentric it is to suppose that there are parts of that system which can be discarded at will, whether aspects of the biodiversity of the wider environment or the sheer fact of other persons, their needs, their dignity, and their hopes. A vital, imagined ecology, a system of life exchanged, is one of those things which we can use, intellectually at least, to push back at the idea that we as individuals or as interested groups can simply change the geography of that ecology according to what we think the balance ought to be in our favor. The fact will always be that we don't fully understand exactly what it is that we are digesting and absorbing from that ecology and giving into it. It doesn't mean that we have a passive attitude to the environment. It doesn't mean anything of a sort of laissez-faire approach to the way the world goes. It does mean that any policy, social or environmental, which assumes our authority to edit the environment we're in, is going to be toxic for us. All of that, as I've already hinted, might serve as a way in to rereading William Morris's News from Nowhere. Because one of the questions that keeps coming back in Morris's wonderful, vivid, witty exposition is, what is it that we are embedded in? And what is it that gives us our security? Morris, I think, suggests at least 3 ways of understanding this. First of all, we are embedded in our work. And as he makes clear again and again in this book, he doesn't mean by that paid work. He means the whole of our engagement with who and what is around us. Our active labor to transform our human relations and our relations with the material world into a situation where there is, and it's as simple as this, shared delight. News from Nowhere is a book about happiness. Not the kind of self-help book about happiness that you find in such quantities on station bookstores, thereby rather glumly illustrating how very unhappy we are, but about the unself-conscious delight that comes both from making and from sharing. One sliver of that is the work we might do to earn our living. On top of that, there's all the work which we freely engage in, and don't always recognize as such, in transfiguring where we are and who we are. And so Morris can speak of the importance of gratuity in work. We do things because we love the thought of the capacities we can display, the effects we can bring about. If people want to decorate and elaborate what they make beyond the merely functional, good luck to them, is Morris's principle. But stripped of the sometimes rather quaint ways in which that's expressed, embroidered tunics and jeweled pipes, that sort of thing, what Morris is saying is that if work is part of our human embeddedness in the environment, that is something far more fundamental than what we do in order to get money in exchange for it. At one point, the narrator of News from Nowhere, a short-tempered, companionable, and voluble 19th century progressive, asks rather bewilderedly about what the reward is of such and such a piece of work. And the surprised reply is, of course, the reward of creation. You've made a difference. That in itself becomes an affirmation of value, dignity, human worth. So we're embedded in work in that wide sense. And to understand what it is for human beings to work, we have to begin there rather than with what we happen to put in order to earn our living. But we're embedded, likewise, in relations. I said in the little introduction I wrote for the new edition of News from Nowhere is that one of the most striking things about the world imagined by Morris there is that his people seem to like each other. It's a small thing, but as they say, don't knock it. They like each other. They're at ease with each other. They recognize that there are quarrels and conflicts, but they are fundamentally committed to making their relations work and to making their institutions work for outcomes that are broadly acceptable to everyone, however long it takes. There's an intriguing discussion of what democracy looks like in this new framework, which includes, and here's a poignant little thing, which includes the idea that where a majority has won over a minority in some debate, if it's a very small majority, the majority will normally give way to the minority because there is quite clearly not sufficient consensus to go forward and change things. Don't know what that makes you think of, but the point is that the process Morris imagines for his utopian future is a process where democracy is a time-taking matter. You need to learn how the human ecology you're part of actually works. That means you need to learn and relearn how other people are thinking about, imagining, and articulating their needs, and you need to work out how that can be sustained as an exchange of life that works for all. It's very slow. It means a great deal of late-night argument in crowded, rather tired halls. It means a tremendous amount of trust, that is, the willingness to carry on discussion even where it seems to be running to the sand, and a reliance on other people's intelligence and sense in articulating where they're coming from. Don't hold your breath in that respect for a democratic revival in our own day. But that sheer time-taking element of democracy seems to me one of the things that News from Nowhere puts before us as a highly significant challenge. In an age when we are both inclined to foreshorten all the time our vision, to look for quick results, and also to imagine that simple votes decide things for good and all. Democracy continues, friendly, combative, argumentative, tense, trustful, all at once. And if that doesn't sound like the democracy we think we inhabit, then maybe we should do something about it. So, an embeddedness in work and the satisfactions of making a difference, an embeddedness in relationships which ultimately are those of ease and equality. Equality not certainly in any mechanical and artificial sense. Morris is an eloquent celebrant of the sheer differences of human capacity and human taste. But equality in the sense that everyone believes they have a right to address everyone else as a neighbour. Fascinating that the standard form of address in Morris's imagined society is simply neighbour. Neither sir nor comrade, but neighbour, which tells us something. Because neighbours, of course, share a neighbourhood. They're aware of a common space that they inhabit. And the ease and equality of social exchange in Morris's world is an ease and equality that comes from that sense of sharing a space, to pick up a word that's been discussed a bit already today. Morris has some interesting things to say about nationality. He's an ardent advocate of the local, and when his visitor from the 19th century complains that the New World sounds a bit as if differences are being ironed out because there are no clear borders and the international regime has changed beyond recognition, the response he has is cross the channel and you'll find that people dress differently and talk differently and like different food. And that's as it should be. No problem, no threat, and nobody feels the need to go to war over differences of food, let's say. So Morris is wary of nationalism as a cult in itself, passionate about localism about the maintenance of diversity. Skeptical, therefore, about over-fixed national boundaries. But that, I have to admit, is one of the areas where he's most vague. The pages on international relations are uncharacteristically cloudy. You can see what he doesn't like, you can see what he does like, you can't always quite see how you sustain what's happening in the middle of it. But that's one of the many areas in News from Nowhere where, of course, a 21st century reader, quite unsurprisingly, will say that's so of its time that it can't be a vision of the future. Morris believes that he is defending gender equality, and he has some very interesting things to say about the capacities of women. He's also a very stout critic of any notion that a woman's function or destiny or nature could be anything other than that of a childbearer. And I think it's fair to say that the 20th century has made a little bit of a difference to that assumption. He's a bit vague about how society keeps order or coerces, because he's so fiercely hostile to the very idea of coercion. Exactly what the sanctions are in the society remain vague. There's a passionate and eloquent attack on the prison system. Prisons are a disgrace to a country, we're told. But exactly how sanctions work, apart from what you might call a heavily socialized process of exclusion with its own moral problems, doesn't come entirely into focus. He also has some interesting thoughts to share on sex and marriage, one of the most challenging of which is that it's quite possible that in a world where there are lots of interesting things to do, sex doesn't always seem to be the most important or interesting of them. And that in itself, combined with the separation of domestic partnership from property relations, that in itself might change the entire domestic economy. So that, for example, you won't need divorce courts. One last very challenging bit from Morris's New World is an exchange where a young woman in the New World expresses her impatience with an older man's interest in books. Books, she says, books are for unhappy people. Rather, as with sex, there are probably better things to do than reading in the New World. Or at least, reading is not the only alternative to sex as a meaningful and agreeable pastime, when there are so many other things you can do humanly to enhance your humanness together. I suspect that a good many people in this audience will have questions about either or possibly both of those assessments. But it's one of the things Morris leaves on the table as part of his challenge to us, to his readers, to think in terms of joy as a social outcome rather than profit or even stability as an imposed value. There's security, there's confidence. And what was said in the last session by Ruth, I think, about the fundamental importance of people being able to trust that their interests are not forgotten, that their presence and their stake in the social order is not ignored. That is fundamental to the world that Morris is thinking of. We need to know not only that our own security against poverty, want, and exclusion is assured, we actually need to know for that our neighbours' security is likewise assured. Because, moving forward to the last bit of what I want to say, prosperity, as we conceive it, is either a shared goal or a poisonous one. either a shared goal or a poisonous one. If prosperity has something to do with imagining the future well-being of others as well as ourselves, then it's a goal or a vision which you might say, in a sense, brings its own internal critique, its own internal logic of criticism. If prosperity is the goal of a shared security, then the pursuit of prosperity is never going to be the pursuit of a constantly receding or constantly expanding GDP, because that will not be possible in a limited world of actual persons. So reconceive prosperity in that sense, and you may see that it has its own inbuilt limits. Detach prosperity from such a vision. Assume that prosperity is about my own hopes, my own aspirations alone, or ours, as whatever interest group I define myself as belonging to. And you have no inbuilt limit, no inbuilt critique. And you have the wholly irrational and profoundly destructive situation in which, as a matter of fact, we seem to find ourselves at the moment. The sparrow element in prosperity, the bit that's about hope, has to be about imagining and hoping for the world we share, not the world we're trying to own and control. In the discussions this afternoon, some of the words that have kept coming back have been belonging, desire, and imagination, the threats of marketization, the commodification of experience and of life. What I've tried to do in this brief reflection relating these discussions to Morris is to think a little bit about what kinds of loss are involved in the world we inhabit. What kind of possibilities have not been and cannot be extinguished by these losses? How we begin to build on those elements that are not to be lost, and how to revert yet again to themes that have come up today, how we tell animating and energizing stories about what's not lost. They may be stories about the present, and there are many of them. They may be utopian stories, thought experiments, methods for thinking about how it doesn't have to be like this. But I think behind all that is the centrality of what Morris is saying to us about inhabiting an actual, material, colourful, resourceful world which promises us joy rather than profit. If we're talking about the nature of prosperity, about ethics and utopias, I think that's not a bad way of defining what the ethical key is. We don't always, for some mysterious reason, associate ethics with joy very much. But perhaps it's time we started. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan, very much indeed. It's a delight to have Rowan as the titular head of our Nature of Prosperity Dialogue series. And as for someone who's probably one of the busiest people in the room, he has always made time for us. So thank you, Rowan, very much for that. We have, before we invite you to some refreshments downstairs, we have 5-10 minutes for some short questions, responses, thoughts on what Rowan has talked about, perhaps a little bit on reflecting on the afternoon, anything that you might like to say that you feel has not been said? Yes. Let's start with this gentleman here.
Would you like to stand up? Thank you.
Should we do the same thing again? We'll line 3 questions up. Is there anyone else who would like to? Yes, the gentleman on the table in the middle there. And one more. Yes, the lady at the front here.
Good afternoon. Capitalism, I understand, is the scale advantages gained from concentrating capital to increase productivity. And we see the results of that today. Lots of productivity and misery generally and uncertainty. It's extremely popular and seems pretty embedded, and it gives the power to the people who control it that seems to indeed influence governments. How can we actually change it?
Are we doing 3 questions?
Yeah, we're going to take 3. So that was a quite small question, so we'll take a few more.
Okay.
Yeah, the gentleman here.
Thanks very much. My apologies if I missed this, but what cannot be lost in the age of artificial intelligence in particular? Thank you.
And the lady at the front?
Thank you. Thank you for your... William Morris talks about children briefly and describes them camping alone in the woods, largely unsupervised and away from adults, with a very free and open education. And I wondered if you'd like to comment on his views on children in relation to sustainable prosperity.
I'd have a go.
Okay.
So 3 very simple, containable questions there. The first one. I don't, believe it or not, have a program for saving the world immediately on this one, but that's where I think I'd want to pick up things that have been said in various ways during the afternoon. We are faced with what looks like, undoubtedly, a monolith in terms of political practice. Monoliths don't easily yield simply to pushing at their base. They may yield to the long process of changes of temperature, vegetation growing around them and putting on pressure. And where we start, I'm taking very seriously what Roger says, you've got to start somewhere. Where we start, I think, is the unceasing attempt to find those vehicles and expressions of local democracy in a Morrisian sense that are still open to us, that can still offer alternative possibilities of how to make decisions and how to operate communally. That's not, in my mind, an alternative to pursuing the public debate. But the public debate is not going to deliver any time very soon. And Morris has a really rather startling section on just how violent the process of transition turned out to be before his world came to be. And that takes me back to the uncomfortable question raised about shock earlier this afternoon, and what sort of shocks actually would change the definition of the normal. After all those people saying in 2008, it's never going to be the same again, it was, of course, within 18 months, and still is. And we're in the process of making many of the same mistakes all over again, as if absolutely nothing had been learned. So there's a very, very long answer, but the short answer, I think, would be something like that. How do we begin to change the climate? How do we begin to sow the seeds of plants which grow up and begin to fracture the monolith? But also, as I say, keep the argument going in public. And there are global platforms which, perhaps more than 10 years ago, allow the argument to be pushed. And to me, it was very interesting to see in the Paris Climate Summit how smaller nations at the receiving end of some of the worst environmental degradation were able to work together against what seemed to be almost invincible interests from larger countries, the larger markets. So, not impossible. Second question. what can't be lost in an age of artificial intelligence. Discussing the role and the possibilities of artificial intelligence would, I think, keep us here again for several more hours, and I'd be fascinated to follow it through. But I suppose in talking about our embodiedness, I'm talking about the way in which whatever artificial intelligence may deliver in terms of problem solving, there remains, in my mind, something about the physicality and locatedness of our thinking, which artificial intelligence of its nature can't capture. It's a binary system at the end of the day, even with the advent of the quantum computer. And I make no claims to understand exactly what's envisaged there. Even with that, something about our sense of location and selfhood in relation to that seems to me to be very hard to capture except in the most minimal way. I don't see, for example, how artificial intelligence can really cope with, let's just take two things, not quite at random, the experience of childbirth and the experience of aging. I can't see what the algorithms are that would translate that. That's a rash thing to say, and I'm sure there's some scientist in the audience who will tell me that that's perfectly straightforward, but that's one observation I want to make about that, and perhaps leave that just to simmer. Third question. This is really one of the most difficult issues we face at the moment. We are unprecedentedly aware of the vulnerability of children, and so unprecedentedly concerned, for all most understandable reasons, to protect our children. So Morris's children going off for a day in the woods, and that would still be possible in the 1950s probably, seem to us to come from another planet. But I suppose what Morris would probably say in response, and if only if he were here, would be, I'm taking for granted that the social bonds and the formation of social bonds in this new society are so close and so candid that the risks of damage, abuse, are simply going to be less because people have matured in different ways. I think that at the moment, one of the things we are aware of in terms of loss is the over-control and over-protection of children. And yet we have devised no way of squaring the circle on that because we are so consistently aware. I speak as somebody who is a member of a church which has many things to be guiltily aware of in that respect. Apparently we can't guarantee safety. Our institutions look compromised wherever we look. So I don't think there's a quick resolution to that. But it does seem to me that one small part of the answer might be what I'd call the deindustrialization of the educational system. That's to say, we have an educational system so fixated on performance and results at the moment, so deeply suspicious of play, that we are all the time compounding this narrowing vision of a growing generation. But again, a long question and a short and inadequate answer.
You might be pleased to know that CUSP is working explicitly with younger people asking exactly the questions that you were asking of them. So my colleague Sue, who's probably in the room somewhere, yes, at the back, would be very pleased to talk to you. Let's take a few more questions. There's a gentleman here, a few other hands up I saw at various tables. Can you show them again, please, to me, because I forgot. Yes, the gentleman here on this table. Anywhere else for one final question? There's a half, is that a hand up? No. Would you like the lady in the red shawl, would you like to ask a question? No. Okay. You have 2 questions to think of what it might be. And there's a gentleman there in the jacket and the orange sweater. Let's start down here.
I may have missed something of what you said because I'm a bit deaf, so apologies. But when you were making your list of things that we've lost, one thing you didn't actually mention, or I didn't hear you mention, was the sense of sacredness. And my own background is in science. I'm sort of hard-headed, but nature conservation or conservation of wild things, very central to my thoughts. And it seems to me, speaking as a biologist, that actually the cause of conservation is more or less dead in the water unless we have a sense of the sacred. So this should be right in the forefront.
That's okay. That's a sort of a question. Yes, the gentleman here.
Harks back to Roger Scruton's talk to an extent. How do we, in dealing with our problems from the bottom up, how do we take account of the fact that psychopaths tend to rise to the top of our institutions, perhaps not the church, but
hopefully,
but other institutions, and they have they've worked themselves into positions of power and wealth, and they are controlling to a great extent how our government works and the laws we get from it.
And a final easy question at the back.
Hi, thank you very much for a stimulating and interesting speech. My observation and question is, we have structures already which could enable us to improve capitalism by working together better. You know, I have my pension with Royal London. It's a mutual society, very much in the model of Morris, but we don't actually connect between ourselves as pension holders. So how can we follow Morris and actually use these institutions that we currently have to their full?
Thank you. Right, shall I have a go?
Have a go.
Thank you for the point about the sacred. I've no doubt I should have mentioned it, but I think I'm taking for granted, in a way, in the whole of what I've been trying to say, that that's how you would have to define the sacred. That is, that's how you would have to define the sacred in terms of what can't be exchanged or can't be commodified. And I've sometimes said that the essence of the sacred is recognizing that the other person or the other thing relates to something other than yourself. There's a life in it that relates quite elsewhere. For me, ultimately, that's God, of course, but it's also the wider network of life. So I'd start talking about the sacred from there, I think. And if I didn't rush to use the word, it's partly because I don't want to take it for granted that it's obvious what it means, and I want to see how it might come out from the kind of discussion I was sketching. Psychopaths at the top of institutions. The important thing then is, isn't it, how institutions build in self-critical processes, self-limiting, self-challenging processes. It's quite difficult, even for the most skilled psychopath in an electoral system, to stay there forever. And we need constant attention to all those aspects of our political ecology which don't depend simply on electoral cycles and electoral popularity, which allow civil society a voice at an angle to whatever the current elected establishment is. And the ideal role for a second chamber in Parliament, which is not quite what we've got at the moment, is that of a civil society element which holds the ring, if you like, for the longer term, deeper issues that the electoral cycle can't cope with. It's intriguing to see just how easily in some other electoral systems supreme executive power can be frozen in the hands of one person and his family and a few friends, and how the politicization of all institutions, judiciary, police and so forth, can result from that. I think that the current situation of the United States is one which ought to make them think quite seriously about their constitutional balances. Never mind the personality involved for the moment, but just the sheer constitutional position that can allow such a concentration of powers in the hands of somebody who's perhaps not a conventional politician. I won't use the word psychopath at this juncture, perhaps. But that's it. What are the institutions that push back, that hold back? Briefly, on the last question, certainly one of the things we ought to be pursuing as part of any strategy of building around the monolith is more effective, more intelligent use of cooperative structures. I happily had a very, very tiny role when I was working in Wales in relation to the employees' buyout at Tower Colliery. I know fossil fuels, but at the time that felt like a major triumph for a cooperative vision which produced for about a decade an extraordinarily Mauritian culture in which there really was voting by the workers on the chief executive's salary and a real culture of interchange and argument and what I would call a deeply sustainable work culture in itself. Of course, plugged into an industry whose moral ambivalence we all recognize in retrospect. But at the time, as a sign of what was possible within what seemed to be a system busy discarding communities and individuals at a huge rate, it did feel pretty hopeful. And I think we need to look at wherever those cooperative opportunities arise.
Thank you, Rowan, very much indeed. So, sadly, in some ways, joyously in others, it's time to give over the joy of intellectual debate and take on some more visceral forms of enjoyment. So you are very much all invited to join us for refreshments downstairs. Before we do that, it would be wrong of me not to thank a few people without whom this event would have been impossible. Thanks, first of all, to our co-hosts, Martin Stott and Catherine de Freitas from the William Morris Society. It's been a real privilege to be doing a joint event with you this afternoon. We're in a house which embodies a medical ethic, and it's great to have had the support of Nicky Brewer, particularly from BMA House, but also in particular, ladies and gentlemen, the man at the back without whom you would have heard none of us, Steve Littlemore. Thank you for the sound, man. The CUSP team has been fantastic as ever. They always will come and do whatever it takes to make these events work. So Sue, Amy, Simon, Angela, Ian, Nick, Ben, Mark, thank you once again for your help making things run smoothly. Particular thanks to Catherine and Linda, who have taken on the organizational burden of making this work as an event. Thank you, both of you. It's been terrific. Linda was also responsible for the rather poetic look of many of our essays, and so that probably deserves a special thanks as well. Thank you, Linda, for making them look so beautiful. But that would have been useless, it's fair to say, without the words inside them. And for that, we have to thank Ingrid Robins, John O'Neill, Melissa Lane, Roger Scruton, Ruth Levitas, and in absentia, John Bellamy Foster. They're a delightful series of essays. Thank you very much for all the work that you put into them. We're particularly grateful, Ufa, that you came to join that group today. You didn't write us an essay. You're very welcome to do so. because in fact we feel that the essay series is so successful, we'd like to say this launch event is not so much the end of an essay series as the beginning of the next series of essays. So certainly if you have an inclination to do that, we would love to have you, and it's been a privilege to have you here talking about your experience, and the very best of wishes with Alternativa. Thank you, Uffe. The credit really for the concept is my colleague Will Davis, who didn't just do the work of drawing those authors together and working with them on the essays, but actually had this idea that philosophy in the public sphere makes sense, and that we can bring those kinds of debates to a broader public and engage people with them in a meaningful way. And so, Will, thank you for having that concept, for all the work that you've done guiding it through today. Will Davis. It is, as I said before, a pleasure and a privilege that Rowan is prepared to give up the precious time when he could be writing beautiful poems to come and be with us. But much of the words that we hear from his lips on every occasion that he's spoken to us today have not been just poetic, but also sometimes sacred, sometimes provocative, and the deep humanism of his perspective is what has guided us through this series of dialogues. We hope that you'll continue to do that. Thank you again, Rowan, for your presence. And finally, it would not work at all as an exercise of philosophy in the public domain were it not for the fact that you turned up. Again, thank you for doing that. Thank you to all of you. Please join us downstairs for some refreshment and association and a little bit of trust building.